cost increases in law school put the blame squarely on U.S. News and World Report rankings. That was because they interviewed educators who find that the most convenient justification. But there's some truth to it. That is, a lot of what the rankings measure is that schools have within their control are things like cost per student, resources available for the faculty, things that cost money to actually improve your ranking, your position in the rankings. And I think all law schools, to some extent, Stanford less so than some, just because of its privileged position, are really attentive to those. And the fuzzy reputational rankings that schools try to affect with glitzy events and publications and so forth, which are a needless drain on the coffers of law schools, are another, I think, sort of ill-fated attempt to raise their status. But how many folks in this room can honestly say that rankings had nothing to do with your choice of where to apply to law school? Well, bully for you. But, and if we'd asked the same question at another law school and you gotten equally honest answers, I'm sure you'd hear the same thing. And faculty care desperately about it as well as students do. Their prestige is very much tied to the institution that they're in. So anything that ups the U.S. News and World rankings, and of course deans live or die by that sword. So I think we can't dismiss that.
Thank you all for putting together this event. This is something that I care about particularly because I am a transfer student in this room, have actually attended another law school. I went to the University of Wisconsin, where employment outcomes are significantly more dire, as I'm sure you know. I would say 75% of my classmates right now in the 2-out class are unemployed and unlikely to find anything certainly paying or likely to lead to full-time employment upon graduation for their second summer, which is starkly different than it is here. I wondered if you could speak a little bit about, you've talked a little bit about the role Stanford has as a market leader in tuition costs, but I wondered if you could talk also about the role transparency has in driving the decisions that individuals make. I'm a little skeptical of the idea that if we disclose all employment outcomes, individuals will naturally not choose to go to law schools that don't have particularly good employment outcomes, but still, I think there's a lot of work to be done in that respect. I know at my school, 75% JD required employment is what they say, but it take very long to find that information, and even if you get what that actually means, it's a little bit suspect in the first place.
Yeah, well, that's crucial. I mean, transparency. I agree with you, by the way. Your skepticism is well taken in regard to like transparency is going to solve everything. I'm not, one of these like national maximum types who believes that like as long as you have enough transparency vis-a-vis information, everyone's going to make good decisions. I think behavioral economics and a lot of other disciplines have punched big holes in that idea, especially when you're dealing with people who, in many instances, are. I mean, not in regard to anyone in this room, but in regard to like the people who go to law school in general, are adults really more in name than in fact, psychologically and emotionally. You can't. I mean, this is a place where. On one level, I think what we've lost is a sense of appropriate paternalism within higher education in general and law school in particular. The idea that you could just take everything that wasn't nailed down because the market would make sure that was a socially desirable outcome is one that I think has been very pernicious in the context of higher education over the course of the last generation. And again, law schools are just a part of that larger problem, although one that I happen to know more about. I just want to say one other thing about transparency. It's true that a lot of people will not be dissuaded even by the most transparent statistics. But law schools have engaged in just absolutely indefensible and egregious misleading and in some cases just flatly fraudulent behavior in regard to disclosing their statistics. And when you consider what you all are put through, when you have to apply for the bar, when you have to disclose some speeding ticket you got 3 years ago, or that you had an open container of beer when you were walking down the street when you were 18 or something. We supposedly are a learned profession that holds ourselves to a really high ethical standard. Law schools could never pass anything like the ethical bars that they've set up in regard to people entering the profession and in regard to our own behavior. So while I agree that transparency is far from a panacea, it's at least an absolutely ethically required as well as somewhat pragmatically desirable first step.
Yeah, well, and the ABA is, finally, because of the lawsuits and the negative publicity, is imposing much greater strictures around transparency. But whether that's going to entirely cure the problem, I think is dubious. Here I guess I differ a little bit. I think that people who go to law school are adults, but adults are all subject to biases towards optimism. It's something that's deeply rooted in our cognitive structure, and you see it playing out in what the newspapers have called magical thinking among a lot of students. But, here's just one study which found that a majority of prospective law students were very confident they would find a legal job after graduating, but only 16% were very confident that a majority of their classmates would do the same. So, there it all is. And, I agree that some level of paternalism is appropriate here. We're massively overproducing for what the job market can absorb. Yeah, all the way back.
Great talk. Let me quick comment. Question. With all due respect, I think excellence should be rewarded when professors at Stanford or at other leading law schools make great. Now, we have a lot of journals, and that's one thing. So I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. Tuition has been going up true, but it's good to have just like Stanford can afford that both intellectually and my question is, how is this inflation marked by students coming from lower tier schools that affect people as a Stanford Law grad?
Well, that's the $64,000 question. How do you feel about the borderline? Stanford, Harvard, Yale. That's all that's left of the old model, where pretty much everyone could feel that they were going to get a pretty good outcome upon graduating from law school. I very much agree with Deborah that what we need is way more differentiation in the legal academic market, just as a starting point. Right? The notion, it may make sense, I have my own doubts, but it may make sense to pay people $400,000 a year to be law professors at like a very small handful of institutions. It absolutely does not make sense at the vast majority of institutions because there's no need for it. If you're going to train people to do some of the basic tasks that Deborah was referencing before, people don't have to be paid $400,000 to do that. They don't have to be paid $40,000 to do that. One of the remarkable things that has happened in terms of higher education in the course of the last generation is that while information technology has lowered the cost of gathering and interpreting information just exponentially, the costs of credentialing in the context of information transmittal have gone way, way up. It doesn't really seem to make very much sense. Now, just to answer your question more directly, I don't know what the situation is going to be 5 years from now, but it could be significantly different. 30% of the class at Columbia is in real trouble. That's one notch below you. Will Stanford be there 5 years from now? I don't know. No one knows for sure. But the thing is, you're the last survivors of an old system that worked well, right? And the question is, do you want to be leaders in regard to saying, look, this thing doesn't work structurally anymore? It works for us, but it doesn't work for the other 98%. Right? You're in a position to lead on that. Why? Because nobody can say to you, oh, you're just a bunch of sore losers. That's what they're saying to your classmates at Wisconsin. Because it's America, right? It's the Protestant work ethic. It's Max Weber. It's like if you didn't succeed, it's because you didn't work hard enough. You didn't get a high enough LSAT score. You should have gone to Stanford. Well, thanks for telling me now. Right? But
yeah, I also don't think that the salary inflation is justified. Frank, close your ears here, but we're really overpaid. You know, when I came in, my first year students were making more than I was, and you know, what's changed in the last decades is not the quality of faculty that we've been able to hire. It's really been an arms race. And you know, a recent study came out that found that that law professors were the second highest occupation in terms of salaries per hours actually worked. I don't know how they came up with that, but you know, I'd like to know what the first one is. You know,
I think it was reality TV show stuff.
Yeah. So you know, I think there's a lot driving it other than the aspiration for excellence that's going on here.
Yeah, there.
Terrible job outcomes all have tenure. They're not going to take cuts. They're not going to retire anytime soon. And unless you close those hospitals, good luck with that. It's not a. What's the fix? I mean, unless the current faculty and the next generation voluntarily take cuts.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Now, I wouldn't be so quick to conclude that law schools aren't going to get closed. There's a back in the 1960s, said it can't go on forever. It won't. And the current, that's kind of almost like a Zen koan of economics, right? It's like if you have one curve moving in one direction, another curve moving in another direction, and it just gets and the disparity between the outcomes for law professionals and the outcomes for the people who they are taking money from get more and more extreme all the time. Because if law professors are the best compensated and happiest profession in the world, just about, which they are, and their students are increasingly entering into a lower compensated and extremely unhappy profession, where, as Deborah referenced, there are extremely high rates of depression and substance abuse and all the stuff that you've probably heard of out there, that's just not sustainable. And the real question that we're facing as a profession right now is, are we going to manage this alteration in some way that is a little bit more controlled and rational, or are we just going to wait for the crash? Right now, legal academia, for the most part, seems to be just waiting for the crash. But that can change, and I think this kind of forum is part of that change. It's getting. I mean, it's great that you guys invited me out here. You know, it's like to have a Visigoth basically coming to Rome to like tell you that you know it's getting pretty sketchy out there in the forest. You know, maybe you ought to get out of the baths for a minute or two and consider you know what's coming down the pike. Now, the question you asked is a great one. I'm not a prophet. I don't know how it's going to change, but it will change. The question is, you know, how.
Yeah. Well, the politics of it are daunting. I grant you that. Yes, you own that.
About what you two think about the feasibility of Stanford being able to produce or encourage its undergrad programs to, I guess, prepare students to take the bar and simply become lawyers straight out of undergrad. What do you think about that?
Well, you know, the pass rates on the bar exam are not so good for people who go to unaccredited law schools. So if we think there's some problems with magical thinking among the population that's seeking a law degree, there are a lot of people who are now being ripped off. Having said that, I think if we opened up the model so that you could have a range of schools that are now locked into this one-size-fits-all structure, competing, innovating, you'd have a lot better chance of getting low-cost forms of legal education that, say, were two-year programs that had innovative third-year externships and other low-cost alternatives to the model. If you had those competing with the unaccredited law schools, you'd have a much better shot at delivering a quality product that would enable students to actually get licensed to practice. In an ideal world, of course, we'd fix the bar exam as well, because there's like almost no correlation between pass rates and demonstrated competence in practice. So, but you know.